I'm so excited to be here today with Andrea Hiott. Is that the right pronunciation?
Hyatt, but good
Hiott,
job. Most people say it like that.
Andrea Hiott. And you're living in Berlin right now, is that correct?
Actually, I live in Utrecht in the Netherlands, but I was in Berlin for a very long time. Just moved here into this place in February. So
Okay. And Andrea has a channel called Love and Philosophy or Philosophy
yes,
and Love.
it's
Love
Love
and
and Philosophy is the channel, and the playlist is Beyond Dichotomies. It's a research channel.
and uh and I found Andrea in the most amazing way. It was one of these synchronicities
Yes, I was.
where somehow in my communication with Richard Watson in preparation
Yeah.
for the video on his new theory, Andrea's email address was on something, and I thought she was Richard's research assistant. So I contacted her about something, and it
Is
turned
that how it
out that she
happened?
was
Because I
also
just got it.
inviting Richard.
Oh, that's funny. Because I thought he had accidentally written to me, thinking he was writing to you or something. Anyway, it was a beautiful
I think that's what
coincidence.
happened, and that's why your
That's how
email
you
was
got my
on
email.
one of the threads that he sent me.
All right.
And then I thought it was on that thread because you were his research assistant. So I started communicating with you. So anyway, here we are. So
Yeah, it was a beautiful thing.
how did you get to Berlin and then Utrecht, and what got you started on your channel? And I guess just give us some background.
Oh gosh. Well, I wrote my first, I guess it all started with my first philosophy class that kind of changed everything. And that was actually in the States. And I ended up writing my thesis on Hegel, of all people.
Oh my goodness.
And I know.
I have a lot
And
of questions about that. I would love
well,
to.
that kind of relates to the beyond dichotomy, right? The
Uh-huh.
synthesis. Um, uh, Even though that's generalizing Hegel, but let's not go into Hegel. But in any case, I thought I should come to Germany to learn German because if I was writing about German philosophers, it felt very strange to be doing it in English. And also, I'd always wanted to be in Berlin. I'd come there once, and it wasn't that I loved it, but it something about it called me. Those kind of feelings where you're like, I got to come back here. So during school, got I found a way to get there and do some studying of German, but also ended up studying philosophy and neuroscience a bit in Berlin. And while I was there, met a really interesting group of artists, other people studying philosophy, musicians, and we started a kind of magazine. And this was a while ago, over 10 years ago. So, and the magazine did pretty well. It sold in stores and stuff. It was a cultural journal where we just talked about all the things we loved. So I ended up staying there. That's a short story. And during that same time, my thesis was really about trying to understand mind as a movement. So a couple of things happened then. I mean, I was studying the philosophy to try to understand what this could possibly, how I could articulate this idea I had of cognition as movement, as the way life moves, just to put it really generally. That was my kind of idea then. And as I was trying to understand that, I ended up in coming across this very strange story about a car called the Volkswagen Beetle. You've probably heard of it, the
Mhm.
original one. And I was so innocent. I just thought this car was like the hippie car. I associated it with Janis Joplin and with these like really cool ads, old ads like Think Small. Um, these ads that sort of turned advertising on its head. Anyway, when I found out it had started with Hitler, for me it was like the perfect kind of Hegelian example at that time of this like two things that could be seen as opposites, but was one vehicle, and it was related to movement, in this kind of young philosophical mindset. It felt like I found a treasure, and I started writing about it, and I ended up writing a book about it. So that was kind of how it all started. And Random House published the book, and so from there, I started linking philosophy and motoring and mobility. So I've worked in both. I've worked in the field of mobility since then, in a way, but also always trying to think of what it means for our cognition, the ways that we move through the world. Um, and then I met my husband, who's Dutch, and that's how I ended up in the Netherlands. Otherwise, I probably would have, stayed in Berlin longer. But I did do my neuroscience degree there after I finished my philosophy degree. And I worked for quite a while. And then I went back and now I'm finishing my PhD, which is putting all the stuff together that I've been working on for the past 10 years. And that's how I started the research channel, because over all this time and all this studying, I've discovered that my brilliant idea is not only my idea. A lot of people have tried to understand mind as movement from different fields and in different places, spiritual places, scientific places. There's a part of the brain that's kind of connected to movement that is also connected to memory, which I studied in my lab rotations. So I started this research channel just to try to talk to all these people in all these different walks of life who I feel like are doing something similar. So that's really how it started. It was just conversations about that. And then people wanted me to share it, and I did. And that's what I'm doing. And then, it's also a good excuse to talk to people like you and get their perspective on some of these ideas, which has been really, really enlightening and helpful for me. So it's been quite a gift, actually. I didn't know anything about YouTube before. I don't know about you, but I was not like, I wouldn't have thought about doing this, but it ended up being the perfect medium for connecting to this wide group of communities. How
Yeah,
did you
I
start
had
with
I
yours?
had nothing whatever to do with YouTube before I
No?
started doing this. And so, yeah, and it's been amazing. It's just been an amazing
Isn't
journey.
it? It's
And
incredible.
I love all the people that I've met and had a chance to meet some of them in person through going to
Oh,
conferences and things like that.
wow.
It's just amazing. I mean, after you've interacted with someone like through the light,
Yeah,
that's what we're doing here, right? Um,
exactly. We're
and then
being
you meet
converted
them in
into light.
person. The funny thing happened to me the first time I met somebody in person that I had on my channel. When I walked up to them to shake hands and oh, and it was the strangest experience. It was as though there was a field in between us, like a field of light particles. I could
Yeah.
it
Like you were
It's
going
really
through the
hard to
screen or
explain, but
something.
it was a very vivid impression as I was walking up to this individual that there was something in between us
Wow.
when we're in the physical that can't be there when you're on Zoom.
Did you ever have that feeling before, or was that a new?
No, I had never
No?
had that
Huh.
feeling. I
You know
think
what it might
I
be
think
is
it's
yeah.
more aware of it because you've created this connection,
Mm-hmm.
emotional, mental, spiritual connection with somebody just
Yeah.
over the wires, and then you meet
Yeah.
them in person and the connection already exists, so
Mm-hmm.
you can see it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to explain it, but
I understand what you mean. I mean, of course, I think of it from the brain and the body, and
Mhm,
like this kind of, because you already have this long history or pathway with
mhm.
that person, but it's embodied, but the bodies haven't been together. So in a way, it's almost, your body's remembering all of that as you're meeting this person, but at the same time, you're having to align to the actual physical experience. So I could see how it would be a real, especially if you're really present. I mean, if you're really present at that moment, you could feel almost like, yeah, like you described it, a kind of jolt of light.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so as you were talking, a lot of things came to mind.
Mm,
I love this. I had not really heard this idea before about um, mind as movement. Now, I've listened to a lot of Michael Levin, so I understand what he's working on, and certainly he is thinking of when he puts mind all the way down to the bottom level, he's thinking of
yeah.
mind as some kind of navigation. But I hadn't really thought of it. I do believe that all those things scale all the way through from the very small to the very large, but I just hadn't thought about it that way. So when you said that, what popped into my head was something I was just reading today in preparation for our conversation about J.J. Gibson's work on
Mm,
ecological perception
yeah.
and
Hmm.
this whole idea of optical flow.
Hmm.
And that certainly seems to be at least one aspect of mind as movement, right?
Yeah, definitely. And that's funny because that somehow relates to what you were just saying about meeting someone in person that you've seen online.
Mhm.
But JJ Gibson, big important influence for me. him as a person in a way. His work has been interpreted all kinds of ways, in good ways, but I think for me, his work, he talks about overcoming dichotomy of mental and physical in a sense. And that for me is a really important change that we need. I feel like we have this knowledge paradigm that it's not that mental and physical shouldn't be separated when we're talking, it's fine, but I think there's a way in which we still think cognition is in the head because of that. And I think part of understanding mind as movement for me is understanding it's embodied and ecological. And J.J. Gibson really started to articulate that in a way that's been very helpful for me. A lot with vision, but you know, also with terms like affordances, which you can trace back to him and then kind of to Gestalt and other things too. But the way he uses it and the way it's been used since, it already kind of, for me, implies a movement through the world, and that the affordances are how you are aligning with that world based on your body. So for me, it's a Gibson is great that you bring that up because it's a way of getting out of the head and understanding cognitions like intelligence, mental state, thoughts as being embodied and ecological. You can never only have, they're not just in the head. And I think that's an assumption in our knowledge paradigm at the moment that cognition is in the head. And I think it kind of, what bothers me about it too is that it separates us from other forms of life. We think we're separate from other forms of life. And I think this mind is movement, which is of course a very general idea, but it's a way of kind of seeing, oh, we're actually all connected. All of life is doing that. But according to your body and your ecological niche or something, that's kind of a Gibsonian idea or von Uxküll, then your cognition will be very different, of course. So it doesn't make sense to say a plant has human cognition or something like that, but it has a body and it's making its way, and that's for me an intelligence, specific to its body and its affordances. But that's, yeah, talking about Gibson could go on, but it's great you bring it up.
Well, one of the reasons I was thinking about it today is also the aspect of his work that I don't hear very many people talking about, but I ran into it through Wolfgang Smith, was the work that he did with the pilots to help identify which pilots would be capable of landing on aircraft carriers.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah, exactly.
So I'm just going to read a paragraph here to kind of orient everybody who's listening. So at that time when they were doing studies to try to identify pilots who could land on aircraft carriers, they originally were using depth perception tests, but depth perception wasn't helping at all in identifying pilots that could land, because they had to be able to see very precisely where to target that airplane on that aircraft carrier. They only get one moment, and if they miss that, then they're either going to crash or they're going to fly off the end, and they're not going to make it. And so it was very important to find this. And so I'm just going to read this paragraph from a book about this. Rather than perceiving space or depth, according to Gibson, we perceive the surfaces revealed to us by reflected light, the layout of the texture on those surfaces, their shading, and any coherent motion that may occur, then specify the structure of the ground, the objects on it, and our position with respect to them. This layout is displayed in the optical array, which is the spherical projection of light to a point at which an eye might be located. This, except for the occasional transparent object, light coming from any local region of the optical array comes from a single object at a single depth value. That patch of light represents ambient reflection from the object's surface, which is locally two-dimensional, just as the retinal is two-dimensional. The local orientation of a surface is typically different than the local orientation of the retina, and the difference in orientation gives rise to texture gradients, changes in the size, shape, and orientation of markings. And what that's saying to me is that there's actually a there. there's actually something that the eye is seeing. It's not that we are that is all in the mind and we're simply interpreting particles being in a certain configuration. There's no
Right.
way that the eye could work this way unless it was actually looking at an object which can reflect light.
Yeah, that's wonderful that that's what you got out of that quote, because and also that you brought up the airplanes, because as I said, I was interested in movement and motoring and planes and cars, and so that was one way I found Gibson too. And yeah, I think right now people like to say we live in a simulation and things like this, and what you said is true, that it's a very simple way of just understanding. Of course, we are in contact with the world. In fact, this perception is immediate, and yeah, it's not a simulation. It's happening as an interaction that can't be just in the head, as I was saying before. I mean, you need this external world, which seems so simple, but we've gotten so confused about how that could actually be. But as you were reading, I was thinking what your perspective as an artist might be, because you deal with light all the time, right? And ways of seeing. Uh,
So the
and
artist kind of takes the other direction, and the artist um, produces form through the use of light,
hmm,
right? So you can see the form, you can see where the light is on the form, but then when you're producing the form on the page, you have to use the, the simulation of light to produce the form. And
yeah,
if what you're after is form, I mean, not all artists are after producing form. Form is a very representational aspect of producing art.
what does
But
that mean exactly if you're after form? You mean making something very realistic or something? I don't
yes,
know
yes,
artistic.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay.
If you want to reproduce, like, like when they start training people on how to produce form, they'll start them with a sphere or an egg or a
Okay.
cone. And then you look at how the light strikes it and where is the light, where's the reflected light,
Mm,
where is the light turning into the shadow, because there's a difference in value at every one of those junctures. And then it's that difference in value that actually reproduces the form or represents the form on the page. And
yeah, for me, that's the simulation. That's the representation is,
mhm,
and beautifully, then it becomes something like the aircraft carrier too. I mean, it's a representation, but then it becomes a landing place for many people to meet and change their regularities, their inner, the way that they're having that immediate reaction with the world. I mean, that's how I think of art often, is like a meeting place or a way we are able to share our kind of unique um, paths that we've walked till now.
mhm.
Um, I don't know. How do you think of it? I
Well,
mean,
I feel
or
that very
can you not
strongly.
think of it too much?
I've often said that a person doesn't need to do painting or drawing in order to participate in this communication that comes through creativity. It could come through cooking, or it could come through gardening, or
Yeah.
any way in which that inner voice that's in you, that comes out of the very unique way in which you have been crafted and developed, and who you are through relationships with people and with books and with ideas,
Mm-hmm.
um, that your voice is needed in the world. And that can't
Amen.
always be articulated with words, very seldom, in
No.
fact. I mean, only really good poets can articulate that voice in a way that it communicates to the heart of another person. But that voice is necessary, because the only way the world becomes whole again is if all of this creative intent from each person gets back out into the atmosphere and starts working together,
Yeah, I
because that's
absolutely
where we
agree with that.
meet. We meet in those places.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I like to, yeah, it's like a landscape in a way. I mean, you have many different kinds, like books can do it, art can do it, cooking, conversations. Those are all very different landscapes, and we all have very different experiences of those worlds. But there's this external creation that we do, which becomes the meeting place. It's beautiful, I think, that we can do this. And
Yeah.
in the creation, you don't have to say, okay, when I was 3, I saw a red horse, and so when I see it in, like, you don't have to go into every little detail of your life that led you to experience the artwork or the book in that way, but you can. You can't. It's like it can lead you to those discussions if you want, and it's kind of opening up this whole other space between people where you can, first of all, realize that you might not be having exactly the same experience when you look at a piece of art or read a book, even if it moves you to the same degree.
Yeah, I can't imagine that any of us could ever have the same experience when we read a book.
Yeah, we can't. I
Right.
think
I
it's
mean, you and
impossible.
I
Not
could read the
exactly the
same
same.
book, but because you've studied Hegel, you're going to have a perspective, whether you agree with Hegel or not agree with Hegel, but because you've
Mhm.
studied Hegel, all those ideas are going to come into your head as you're reading, and they're little puffballs that get stuck on the Velcro of your
Definitely.
brain, right?
I like that.
So, and because I have just very peripheral knowledge of Hegel, so he rarely pops into my head unless something comes up about a synthesis, right? And then
Right.
right.
Mm.
I would like to have that conversation with you about Hegel, though. Maybe
Oh,
sometime
sure.
if
I would
we
love to
talk
talk
about,
about Hegel.
maybe someday if we decide
Mhm.
to talk about polarities and dualities, we can talk about.
Yeah, we could do that with the other stuff. I'm not a Hegelian, but I do think his writing kind of illustrates in a way that movement of why we need to talk about opposites and why there are no opposites at the same moment.
Well, I'm assuming that you've read a lot of Ian McGilchrist, because
I
obviously he
have,
talks about the coincidence of opposites a lot. And
yeah. Asymmetrical Reconciliation is a review I wrote of McGilchrist's book, actually, because, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot in there.
so when you say asymmetrical reconciliation, what do you mean?
I think I mean that what I just said in a way. It's that I mean, I'm coming from the Pasteur quote and stuff, but thinking about asymmetry is kind of a key in a way to, I think, understanding. And for me, it speaks to this notion of not having to, but learning to hold the paradox. I mean, I was talking about mental and physical not being opposites, but also being important words in our vocabulary that have helped us understand the world. And that can seem contradictory. The same way it can seem contradictory for me to say that cognition is not in the head, and also to say for humans, the brain is necessary for cognition. But they're not actually opposites. So when you go really deep into it, you find that opposites are actually ways of getting you to a very sturdy, dynamic meeting point. And in that, it's
Marriage
almost
is a
like a
good
black
example
hole
of
of
that, right?
transcendence. Sorry, what?
Marriage is a good example of that.
Marriage is a great example of that. That's a
Yeah.
very real life example. Can you stick with it? And you go through many points, right? You you have asymmetries and they reconcile, but then that's not a static spot. You've both changed in that process, and
Mhm.
so it continues.
Yeah. And another thing that's very important to me with art is how um, that issue of not being static means that you've created a new context with each one of those events that's happened, or each choice that's made creates a new context now. So every next choice is based on the context that is currently there. And
Right.
I mean that's a cliche, basically. That's all obvious, but I think people don't often think about that when they are making choices. Like, this context has now changed, or in
Mm-hmm.
a relationship. But I wanted to ask you back on the whole issue of cognition. Um, Attention is a very important aspect of cognition, and I wondered if you had run into Jonathan Pageau and his work on attention.
Not sure. Can you tell me more? It doesn't
Okay,
immediately. It
well,
seems familiar, but I.
um, he has become over the years a friend of Jordan Peterson,
Oh, okay.
and Jonathan has a website and a YouTube channel called The Symbolic World.
Okay. I write it down.
And he looks at things from a very, obviously a very symbolic perspective, thinking about the need to kind of re-enchant the world, to bring meaning back into the world, rather than this strictly materialistic, reductionistic separation of mind and body, to bring meaning back into the world. And so actually I wrote some notes. I'm going to bring up my notes here because I wrote some notes this morning while I was thinking about this. So Jonathan was in an interview today where, or at least they published it today, where he's talking about how the scientist, there's nothing, the science is a great thing, but science is based on abstractions. But as human beings, we don't live in abstractions, we live in experience.
Yeah.
Just like I was talking about with J.J. Gibson, and that there is a there. So nobody lives in the scientific world of abstraction. And that made me think about your guest that I was listening to yesterday, Jeremy Lent. So when you were talking to Jeremy Lent, he was talking about the Platonic view, being that this world of forms is all perfect and beautiful, but the earth is a pale copy, and that Christianity came along and adopted that view. I think he had a bit of a misunderstanding there about Christianity, because I don't think that's the view at all that that Christians have. The aspect of Platonism that got adopted into Christianity is a bit more subtle than that. But the Christian view is certainly that the world is fully based on experience, lived experience among embodied people. And the earth is actually exhibiting the glory of God in all the color and splendor and beauty that is in the earth. So it's not a pale copy of a perfect idea, but it's an ongoing process of manifesting.
So it's not you said exhibiting, sorry to stop you, but are you meaning it is that, or it's not a representation, right? It's
not a representation, but
it's not a
but let's say when you look at a tree, it's not a simulation. There's actually a tree there.
Yeah.
But when you look at that tree can exhibit to you many different truths about the way the world functions. It grows up, the roots grow down. There's a story there, right? The capillary cells grow up in a way so that the water can be driven from the ground up to the leaves. In another way, when the leaves evaporate water, then they draw the water up to themselves. So there's a dual action going on. There's a story there. There's 1,000 stories in how a tree comes into being and what it does and what it looks like and what you can learn from the leaves and the bark and all the layers. I mean, there's 1,000 stories there. Those are stories that speak to us about the beauty and intricacy and complexity of the world, that also relate to many other aspects of human existence. So in that way, I say that the world is exhibiting the glory of God if you really pay attention. But attention, the really important thing about attention is that, well, first of all, before you can pay attention, there has to be something to pay attention to. And also, attention itself requires some sort of a framework, because if you don't have a framework for attention, your attention is completely smushed out.
Scattered.
There's so much combinatorial explosion that you're looking at every instant. If you don't have something guiding your view towards a particular point, then attention can't even happen. So I'm just wondering what you think about in the world of cognitive science, how attention relates to meaning.
Oh, goodness. Well, let me come back to the attention and meaning, because first I have to say trees are real teachers for sure. So I love that you went into that. They've been great teachers in my life and brought me to some very important relationships. And I like that tree behind you, by the way.
Oh,
Um, and but the second thing I was thinking about is the confusion. You said the symbolic world, and is the name of his, was it a blog or a book or
it's a website
website?
and a magazine and a YouTube channel.
Oh, great. Well, I'm gonna definitely look at it because I do think it's a different kind of world, or I might call it a landscape, the symbolic or the representational. And I think we confuse it all the time with the living, biological, physical landscape worlds. There are many of them. But something like saying that we live in a simulation, for example, or something very simple, just the way, in neuroscience we look at pictures of brains all the time. And they're often photos of brains that have been pixelated and to look for a very specific thing. But when you just see them in the magazines, Scientific American and so on, you just think, oh, that's a brain and that's the activity in the brain. You kind of confuse the representation with the thing. Just it's an assumption, right? It's a very nuanced, quick kind of thing. But and I think we do it all the time, and we don't have attention on that we confuse representational worlds. I mean, it happens also with social media and things like this in more difficult ways, I think, especially for younger people these days, where it's so confused, those worlds or those landscapes. And a lot of that has to do for me with that knowledge paradigm that I think we need to shift of confusing cognition as being something in the head. But I won't go into all that at the moment. But attention for me, and I would like to know what you think about this, is something so when you were talking, I was thinking about little kids, right? And they can't, like, it's the old story of trying to walk down the sidewalk with the kid, or with my dog for that matter, who is here somewhere there. Um, they want to look at everything, right? And every sound and every flower and every piece of grass. And is that attention? It is for me, I think.
Mhm.
But it's a different kind of thing than um, knowing that you have attention. For me, that's a very interesting, beautiful process that has a lot to do with the symbolic world or the representational world, because I would put language in that world. I think those are representations, symbolic worlds that we've created to communicate with one another. And through that, we learn how to put attention on our own attention. um, and
So
that
you're talking
is
about
very meaningful.
you're talking about the metacognitive level when you're
I don't know if
talking
it's
about consciousness. I mean,
cognitive.
is that what you mean when you're talking about putting attention on our attention? You're talking about
Yeah,
consciousness?
I mean, it's a great question. I think a lot of people would take it as that. In the literature, it's exactly the way you described it, but I'm not sure that attention and cognition should be considered the same thing. First of all, they're just words that we're using to try to understand dynamic processes that that are kind of boundless. But even so, consciousness for me is not the same thing as mind, intelligence, and cognition, which doesn't mean they aren't found together, all the time. But I think this life, this feeling of being alive, this phenomenology, this existence, we have that. I mean, everything has that as life, but you don't always know that you have it. And I do think there's something about moving through the world and all these different landscapes, the physical ones, the linguistic ones, the books we read, the art we see, the movies we watch, all of that, matrix, you might call it,
Mhm.
uh, does like help us in a way to start to understand that we are conscious. But I do think it's good to understand that they're different, right? The cognition is more of an ability of the consciousness to come to know itself better. And hopefully that means not only our body, but that we start to understand the wider ecology as part of us, that life is doing this, not just me and you. Um, and I know that's kind of nuanced, but so I guess attention for me is closer to that sense of consciousness and being alive, and gets very much confused with cognition, because cognition is the way that we come to know ourselves as conscious. And that's a very tricky thing to separate, and I'm not doing it perfectly, but I do think there's a difference. All life for me is conscious and attentive, and has some form of cognition, but the human form of cognition is a way that draws attention back to the consciousness of the world and its ability for attentiveness. And that is something, I don't know, I feel like there's a great amount of responsibility in that shouldn't just be glossed over. So yeah, attention is a really intense, important thing for me, not just something that I would like lump, as often is lumped with, an area of neuroscience or something like that. For me, it's definitely an embodied, bigger thing. It's very hard to study. But you said attention and meaning. That's interesting. Yeah, and you're the meaning code, which I wanted to ask you about. That's a really interesting title.
Well, okay, let's go back and look at this word attention then, because as you were speaking, I realized that I have tended to focus on it in several different ways. Maybe those ways are all connected, and that creates this larger scope that you're thinking of. But I hadn't thought about that larger scope that you're thinking about. And as you said, it's a very complicated thing, so I don't quite understand what you're saying, but maybe that would make a whole conversation right there, trying to understand that principle.
Yeah, it would be very helpful to try to talk about it. I heard you once say that you think through conversation, and I think it's actually a really good way to think through those kind of things.
Yeah. If I think of attention from the viewpoint of an artist, that's one thing. If I think about attention from McGilchrist's viewpoint, that there are two kinds of attention. There's the right hemisphere kind and the left hemisphere kind. That's another kind of attention. And then if I think about attention from and I'm not a physicist, but I have tried to delve a little bit.
You've studied a lot of it. You've had a lot of conversations.
Enough of physics to get an idea of this whole idea of the observer problem. If I think of attention from the aspect of the observer problem, let's start there, because in that sense, attention seems to me to be a kind of measuring process. And the way that shows up in the observer problem is that there has to be a measuring instrument in order to see where the particle is. Whether that measuring instrument itself collapses the wave into a particle or not is still a question, but at least the measuring instrument shows you where the particle is in the wave field. But let's just think of attention or observation itself as a kind of measurement. And what fascinates me is this idea of measurement shows up so many places. One of the conversations I had with Mark Solms, who is a neuroscientist who's done a lot of work on consciousness.
Yeah, great stuff. He's working with Levin, I think, a lot, maybe, or he talks about it a lot.
I introduced those two.
Did you? Oh, that was a beautiful introduction.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I could kind of tell after talking to Mark Solms and listening to a lot of Levin that those two would have a lot to talk about.
Oh, wow. You were right.
Yeah. But Mark Solms's idea, based on his book about the source of consciousness, is that consciousness did not arise just when the two hemispheres of the brain, but from the brain stem itself, and that it arose out of the homeostatic processes of. Now I put it all over into my own language, so I can't even remember his language about this, but in my language, it's a value judgment. Very primitive entities can tell if it's hot or cold and which they need, whether to move towards the hot or move towards the cold. So even at the brainstem level, this homeostatic process takes place. You need to normalize so that you get within the parameters of what it takes to live, to continue living. So that is a kind of a measurement. It's like a thermostat makes a measurement, or I've talked a lot with this physicist who understands finite state machines very well, and like a coin operated parking meter is a finite state machine. So when you drop the coin in, the machine is calibrated to recognize what size coin has come in. So then it can flip over, and it knows that there's the dial should go up to like 1 hour or a half an hour or 2 hours based on the size of the coin that's dropped in. So that's a measurement process. And the way that Solms described that is the entity or the organism is palpating the environment.
Ooh, palpating the environment. I like that.
I think that's the word he used. Either he used that word, or that's
whoever used it. It's great.
That's the way it spoke to me. It's this idea of palpating the environment, moving out, touching. Like Levin shows these videos of slime molds, and even a slime mold will, even though it's only one cell, it's always trying to determine the environment that it's in. And
for me, it's making way. But
yes.
So for me, I mean,
that gets us to your paper. So,
but I do
have the other conversation about attention some other time, because I really want to talk about this paper.
Okay, but this is also connected to my paper. So I want to, this measurement idea, or it's connected at least to like my thesis and stuff, because I've thought about that word a lot. And
measurement.
And also, I think this gets to the confusion with the symbolic world or the representational world or the scientific, the brain I was talking about, all the stuff that we've created in order to meet, whether it's art or scientific or whatever, there's many different ways. I think it's very easy to confuse that for what is being measured, So for the map and the territory thing, I'm sure confusing the map for the territory. I think measurement is happening all the time, but for example, when we look at the slime mold, it's not that the slime mold is measuring. It's that more in the way you described Gibson, I think, to go back to that and link it. The slime mold is aligning with what it encounters. It's making its way. We're measuring that by looking at it, but I'm not sure that the slime mold needs to measure it. I mean, we don't need to measure love when we feel it, and we don't need to measure hunger when we feel it.
But you're using measure. You're using measure in a different way there.
I am, but I think it's I think it's actually not a different way. I think in the same way that we confuse the pictures of the brain with the brain without knowing we do it, I think talking about this as measurement is confusing our own perspective and even our link to the slime mold. The fact that there is a continuity of cognition or of consciousness that you can't separate with that. So, I mean, again, we could have a whole other conversation about that, but I do think it's important to understand when we talk about measurement or assessment that it's our measurement or assessment. It's not necessarily theirs, which doesn't mean that there isn't alignment going on. I mean, two cells are constantly changing their parameters. A cell is constantly interacting and changing its parameters, but I don't think I would call that, the cell measuring so much as that it's more direct, it's aligning, it's fitting to this. Yuri Puzaki uses this idea of fitting, or
all of this stuff comes together. The fitting to, the aligning.
Yeah,
you could call it making contact with reality. Right. So in my mind, that making contact with reality is a kind of measurement, because if I let's use the word measure up. Do I measure up? Do I measure up to something? if there's a goal that is important and I'm missing the goal, then I haven't measured up. That's the sense of measure that I'm using here.
But that to me is already way far
Well,
away.
because this
Like,
is a
so
big,
if we go back to like development, when you were a little child, a baby, when you're a baby, you come into the world and you're aligning. You're building patterns of regularity as a system that is not separate from every single thing you encounter. Every word, whoever your caretakers are, say to you, every sound, everything, right? In the same way you described earlier. And then as you learn language and as you learn to read and everything you watch, and you're constantly, you can't stop the alignment. There's no time for measuring. It's almost like you're being molded, up to the point where you can realize that you're being molded. Then you can start to do some molding yourself, and that for me is where the measurement
oh, so
begins.
you're
So,
thinking of measurement as being, I see where the problem is coming. You're thinking of measurement as being an intentional act. And that's why here's where the confusion is coming in. So let me explore this. Let me make it a little bit bigger for you. Okay.
Okay.
So let's think about contact with reality. Is that a picture that you can accept here? This contact with reality?
Yeah, sure. Or
Just
something like
leave measurement
homeostasis.
aside. Thinking of fittedness, contact with reality, palpating your environment. You have that picture. Okay. So are you familiar with the work of Esther Meek?
No. You're
Okay.
introducing me to a lot of people now. This is
Well,
great.
Esther Meek did most of her, she's a philosopher using the work of Michael Polanyi, who, as I understand, was a mathematician. You've probably run into Polanyi.
Mm-hmm.
And
I
Polanyi
think he's
had
in his
this
book. I
idea
have.
about contact with reality. And
Okay.
so Esther, kind of working with that idea of contact with reality, was looking at the whole aspect of knowing. There's many different kinds of knowing. And I'm sure you've run into John Vervaeke with the 4 Ps of knowing, and one of those is procedural. So it's easy to talk about this from the standpoint of procedural. One of Esther's examples that she uses is, suppose you want to learn to ride a bicycle, or you want to learn to take care of your rose bushes. Before you can do an adequate job of that, you have to have a relationship with that. You have to have a relationship with the rose bush. You have to come to know the rose bush well enough that you can understand what it needs.
Yeah.
This is the way a mother is with a child. Mother has
Right.
to know the baby well enough to know what the baby needs. So in many ways, knowing is a process of relationship. And Esther looks at it from the standpoint of the object that you're going to know is actually reaching out to you with the information that you need, is reaching out in a loving way to initiate the relationship so that knowing can occur. Okay, so
It's sort of a Gibsonian affordance, isn't it? Like an opportunity for
yes, it
behavior.
would be like a Gibsonian affordance. My viewpoint is, yes, I see that, because to me, reality is always reaching out with love for us to build that relationship. So when a child is becoming fitted to the reality around them, the child is responding to that offer of love and finding the place where the love meets and creates the good relationship. Because when we don't measure up or make that alignment, then we suffer the consequences of the world when we're not aligned. There are a lot of consequences that come with not aligning with
Absolutely.
that. So
I
I
agree with that.
apologize if using the word measure created some disturbance in there, but I use it very specifically because recently in my Bible study, I've run into this word measure over and over and over again. It goes all the way back into the first chapter of Genesis when it's talking about the gathering of the waters at the beginning, when the water is separated from the dry land. That gathering of the waters is being bound up with a cord, and that cord is a measuring cord. And so this picture
There's
of
another famous
measure,
Bible, some or not famous, but one I remember learning about the measure of all things or something. Measure of, I don't know.
I think that
Anyway.
I think that's a line from Shakespeare, actually.
Oh, maybe. Sometimes I do
A
confuse
man is the
Shakespeare and the
measure
Bible.
of all things, which is, no, maybe it wasn't Shakespeare that said that. Maybe he was quoting somebody else when he said that. Anyway, yeah.
I don't know if I don't think I get the words right, but there is some verse you reminded me of my childhood in Bible school, and there's some
Mhm.
measure. You're right, it's in the Bible for sure, in some.
Well, it doesn't always come out as the word measurement in the Bible translations that we have, but as I've gone back and explored some of these concepts through the Greek,
Oh,
and
yeah.
I'm not a speaker of Greek, but I have a good concordance.
Oh, great.
The measuring line, the measuring cord, this thing shows up over and over again. And it's as though there is a way that that the loving reality is trying to show us, here's how you can stay safe. This
Mm,
is a loving, safe environment,
mm.
but you have to live within the loving, safe environment in a way that is fitted to it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, have you read Piranesi by Susanna Clark?
Yeah. I love that book. I have it.
I
I just
love
had it
that
sitting on
book.
my
Well,
desk.
okay,
Oh, beautiful book.
so the house, right? The
Yeah,
beauty of
yeah.
the house is everlasting. The
Mm,
house, he learns to live within the house in a way that to him is beautiful and safe and meaningful.
mm-hmm.
To me, that's the picture right there.
Yeah.
But in order to do that, he has to do a lot of measuring. He has to
Mm-hmm.
watch the skies and see when the rain is going to come and when the tides are going to come. He's
Yeah.
always doing all this measuring to understand the space he's living within so he can be fitted to it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think we're saying the same thing from different ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that all that you just described, like in the book, he's an adult and he's realized that he has consciousness. Is it a he? I always imagined it was a she for some reason, but
Oh no,
or maybe I
Piranesi
didn't.
is a
Maybe
he.
I just didn't imagine he or she.
Yeah.
Um, uh, but in any case, uh, that kind of measuring is what I was talking about as being able to develop agency, noticing your
Mm-hmm.
own consciousness, and
Mm-hmm.
you can call it assessing or measuring or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, but that for me is different from like a little child that just comes into the world and they don't have they can't assess like yet. They can't say, oh well, okay. I mean, the world is just. I do think the world is love. I really do think that everything is love, but let's be practical too. And some of us, not me, but there are people who come into the world in ways that are very challenging,
Yes, yes.
and they have to align to it, and they
Mm-hmm.
do, but it can create very unhealthy patterns
Mm-hmm.
and illnesses that only once they've reached that point where they can assess it can they start
Mm-hmm.
to change. And who knows why this happens, and we could look at it in many different ways, but it definitely happens, and it's
Yeah,
not,
yeah.
you know, we know it happens. So for me, that's you're aligning without a choice. And when you start to measure, there's a space of choice, an
Mm-hmm.
agency, which doesn't mean that, the people around you aren't measuring and having agency. For me, we can also widen this to you're never just the baby that's come into the world. You're always, as you were saying, in the relationship of love
Mm-hmm.
in whatever way that's manifesting, right? So those people are your measurement. In the same way we are the measurement of the trees
That
in a
that
sense now,
that's it right there. So yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, that's so perceptive. Yeah, because like for example, one of the other scientists that Michael Levin pointed me to is Anna Soto, who works with
Mm-hmm.
cells, and she explained how a neuronal cell that's being grown that in the body that is developing in an environment that is softer will grow into say a brain cell, but a cell that's growing into a part of the body that's got more tension will grow into
Yeah.
a muscle cell.
Wonderful.
Same
Wonderful
thing, right?
example. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what you're talking about is the environment. If a child is growing up in a harsh environment, they align to that in order to in order to persist,
Exist.
right?
Yeah.
Right?
To
Just to
exist.
survive,
Yeah.
you have to align. So that aligning is always taking place.
Oh
And to
yeah,
me,
there's
that
no
aligning
choice about that.
is a measurement process. Not in the sense that you're taking a tape measure and measuring, but you
Or
know
that
when you're
that
bumping
agent is
into the
measuring. But
when
yeah.
you're bumping into the thorns and when you're not, right?
Right, and that's how you align, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to go there, you want to go here. Same way the
Right.
slime mold or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. I think one thing that I should probably didn't explain is that and you brought up Vervecchi and I haven't read it all yet, but I know he delves into this a bit, is the way we use the term consciousness. And
Hmm.
I was using that in terms of attention. And I think that's also another big confusion that maybe it sounded like I was saying consciousness in the sense that it's usually used, which means that we're aware of ourselves as agents, that
Hmm.
we're, that we experience the feeling of heat and know we experience it. And this kind of like, uh, knowing that we are human, consciousness, we are conscious of each other. But I actually think in the same way, there's a development of that when I was talking about consciousness, I just really mean the feeling of being alive, which any life has according to its body and its ecology. So maybe that was part of the confusion too, is that we start like that. And that is, that's life. That's as long as you're existing, you do that. And through aligning and fitting to the environment, or however you want to say it, you develop ways of navigating it. And and those are measurements. Those do work through measurement in the way you were saying, whether it's your measurement, usually not yet. It's other people around you, but you develop how to assess your own self. And then that for me is kind of consciousness of consciousness, which is what most people call consciousness.
Hmm.
There's a lot of confusion about that, I think. I don't know if you've
So
read that
the
stuff from
feeling
Verbeck.
that now this is an interesting thing that I'd like to explore sometime too, as somebody like you who you seem to have a lot of knowledge about many different things. So the feeling of being alive. So you identify consciousness with the feeling of being alive. And would you say that even a cell has that level of consciousness, the feeling of being alive?
Before I answer, I would say, just to go back, that we have to understand when we're using these terms that we often think of them, and not you, but um, in general, people, we think of them through our human framework. So when I say that a cell is conscious, or that a cell has intelligence, I don't mean it has anything like a human experience of consciousness or
Hmm.
cognition,
Yeah,
because
I get
how
that.
could it? It has a completely different body. It's in a
Yeah,
completely different ecology. You can't compare those, but
right.
the problem is we often think, when we just say that, then we think, oh, they're saying a cell has something like how I've experienced cognition and intelligence,
Hmm.
which is insane. I mean, of course, no one really thinks that.
Hmm.
But yes, of course they're conscious. I mean, how can we be conscious if the parts, what we've decided are parts of us? I mean, it's all one movement, but
Hmm.
we can study cells as separate, in that sense of measurement and representation. Of course, it has a feeling of being alive, which is, I think, what you're saying about measurement. And I don't think it's measuring, but if the cell is existing, it's making its way. And for me, only that's life, that's conscious. I don't mean that it's conscious of itself in the way that a human is. But, two cells are interacting, and there's something going on there, that we could
Yes.
probably, yeah, understand. Yeah.
Um, well, so somehow for me, this all comes down to the will to live. Even a cell has a will to live,
Yeah.
but where does that come from? That will to live, that insistence on persisting.
This is something I've thought about a lot, and I think it's a weird question that I ask myself, frankly. I've asked myself that. And then when you start to think about it, you're already assuming certain parameters. I'm assuming a certain knowledge paradigm, a certain linear understanding of what's going on, which I think is what the way we've come to wake up to ourselves as conscious cognitive beings. I'm not saying it's wrong to think of there being beginnings and ends, and of course, from our perspective, we see people born, we see people die. These are very important experiences in our life. They matter. and they're real. But from another perspective, that's a transformation, So why, I mean, it's almost kind of weird to say, is it ever a choice to persist? I mean, this is what is, it just is. So, um, I don't know that asking, I think we're imposing a linearity that there was a beginning and there will be an end to whatever this
Well,
amazing
I guess that
ongoing
for me, the
experience is.
question comes from, let's roll it all the way back to the origin of life.
Mm-hmm.
In order to do that, I guess you have to have some sort of definition of life, which is something you go into a little bit in your paper.
Mm-hmm.
So roll it all the way back to before first life, and there's some sort of chemical molecular thing going on. And let's just say that, and if you've looked into this origin of life stuff, you understand that even the very simplest cell that is even conceptual already has 500 genes in it. So
Yeah.
500,
Mm-hmm.
500 base pairs in the DNA of even the very simplest cell. So it's incomprehensible really to think about, but let's say that you have this original cell, and part of what distinguishes it as life is that it is self-replicating. It has some, how do you talk about this without anthropomorphizing? It has some desire
Yeah.
to replicate.
Mm-hmm.
Why else would it replicate? I mean, everything else, rocks are sitting there, they're not replicating,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
The only way a rock becomes more than one rock is if it gets hit by another rock and turns into a bunch of small rocks, but the
Right.
rock is
Which
not
is why we can
replicating.
say rocks aren't conscious, for example.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so well, but there again,
But they're
yes.
part of a larger conscious or
Well,
cognitive
no, but
system.
I mean, if you take a rock all the way down to the atomic level, there's something going on with electrons. I don't know that you'd call it consciousness, but there's perhaps some sort of choosing that goes on with electrons.
Yeah. I've
So I
thought
mean,
about that a lot. It can be very hard to find some kind of a boundary. And I think that's what I was trying to get at is we don't actually need to define life because just as we were saying in the beginning, it's dynamic. So there was never one kind of life and there never will be a definition of that. But what we can think about are patterns that that all that we call life has in common with one another. And that for me is the kind of representational or symbolic or measurement that we do in order to improve our agency, improve our connection to one another, um, create knowledge. But I do think we've got this knowledge paradigm of beginnings and ends and parts, and that cognition is in the head, and that growth means more. And these are all true knowledges that have served us in the past. But what life is changing, and what knowledge is changing, and there might be a completely other way that we could start to understand what's going on here and what our part is in it, and even where those boundaries of self are. And when you start doing that, and then you look at these stories, which science is very important to me. So is spirituality, but I mean, there are different ways of trying to understand different things or the same thing. But we know, of course, that we don't know the whole story. We have a very good scientific knowledge of the beginnings of what we call life and so on, but we're also using a very particular body to assess that. So some other, in the same way that the slime mold or the cell or whatever doesn't need to understand our human level of life, and doesn't even need to know that it exists. And in fact, it's like a completely different landscape and a scale of ongoing stuff. We need to know about them now to stay alive, but they don't need to or they don't necessarily know about us in the same way. Probably the beginning of life and all that's going on in whatever this amazing, dynamic, ongoing process is that we call life, there's probably a lot more there to it that we just haven't been able to get a grasp on yet. So maybe if we start to shift the knowledge paradigm a little bit, we'll start to realize we could actually sense the world differently, exist in the world differently, connect differently. And then I think those questions start to shift, that it's not as it's not as it's not only as it seems right now in terms of how we define something like life. And when we start getting way caught on trying to define life, we kind of miss the point, because it's like what you were saying about a relationship. You never can define your marriage, It's you never can define love. I mean, these aren't things that have definitions that don't change. So, yeah, we don't need to define life. We don't need even to define cognition and consciousness, but what we need to do is observe the patterns of them and start to see uh, how we might think about changing these very particular knowledge landscapes that have served us well up to this point, but that perhaps now it's time to think differently. Not to think about parts, but to think about patterns, for example. Not to think of
Well,
cognition
so
as in the head, but in the body and the ecology.
this is exactly why I brought up the whole issue of will to live, because
Mm,
Darwinism presumes some sort of that which the survival of the fittest, or that the environment selects for that which is most fit to live,
mm-hmm.
which presumes some sort of survival. Okay.
Yeah.
But so one of the things Jonathan Pageau was talking about on this podcast this morning was that he said, rather than talking about the will to live, or the survival instinct or something of entities, he said, think about it this way: the pattern of reality is the persistence of being. So that goes all the way
That's
back to the
wonderful.
beginning.
Yeah.
The pattern of
Mm-hmm.
reality is the persistence of being. So you can think about it that way without having to think about this issue of where is the place between life and non-life. Just look at the
Exactly.
being
Yeah.
itself. So I'll
That's
send you that
beautiful.
video if you want.
Please do. Because that's kind of what I was trying to say in a way, is that yeah, we've learned how to think in particular ways that we think that we can't help but assume are uh everywhere true in that way. But
Mhm.
if we can start to just let go of those a little bit, we don't need to say they're wrong because they've served us fine, but let's let go of them. And in that way, we're saying being is its own reason for being if you
Mhm.
let it be. And then you can start to explore other potential ways of being. And you start to even expand your own notion of your being. And
Mhm.
then you get into a whole other world. You don't need to ask those questions in the same way, but you can still be very rigorous. It's not about not being rigorous and observing and measuring and so on. But it's, as you were like, talking about that, I was thinking about something like artwork, or a piece of art that really moves you. I've had a few times in my life where the artwork really does something, where you kind of you aren't you don't need to have a self in that moment, but you're very present. I think all great art does that in whatever form. That's kind of the moment that I'm trying to talk about too, is in those moments there's a shift that then some of the questions that seemed so important before don't matter at all anymore. Maybe there's a way we can do that on a larger scale too.
That's a little bit of the way that DC Schindler talks about beauty.
Hmm.
That
I thought
when
about
you're
asking you about beauty.
captured by beauty, it's a reciprocal process, because you are simultaneously taken up into the beauty, but the beauty is being taken up into you.
That's wonderful. I guess it comes back to that meeting space though for me, that it's
Mhm.
sometimes beauty. I think I'm a little, I worry about that word because I worry in the same way that we have these very definite assumptions about things having beginnings and ends and cognition in the head and whatever, that we also have aligned with particular notions of beauty that don't need to really be what they are. But then there's the sublime and that kind of a beauty, which is maybe more uh, what you mean. But I think it's the meeting place. It's the beauty that I'm talking about might be when you're standing in front of a particular tree or a landscape, or you're looking into someone's eyes, or you're just feeling love
Mhm.
with someone, or the artwork as I described, where it's just that that kind of beauty is a like a portal,
Mhm.
that opens. And it actually happens in science too. I think these kind of eureka moments where you've put so much time and effort into something.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I don't think
That
those are really separative.
that's exactly what he's talking about when he's talking about beauty. It's that moment.
Oh,
Yeah, it's that moment. It's
yeah.
not looking at a pretty painting. That's not what he's talking about. Or hearing a poem that gives you feelings of, mystified, that he's talking about that moment. And that moment can be, you know, looking in the eyes of your child for the first time, or
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
or even when a dog looks at you a certain way,
Yes,
and you can see
definitely. Oh,
right
I have it all
into,
the
there's
time
like
with
a
my dog.
universe in their eyes, right? Yes.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking
I
about.
definitely know. Yes, of course.
So
Yeah, I think the beauty thing was more just that we should look a certain way, or that I'm getting older now, and I think about this aging process where when you're told you're beautiful all the time when you're young, and then what does that mean? It's a certain um there's a way in which beauty isn't everything if we can open ourselves beyond some of the alignments that we've unconsciously taken on in our lives through our media, through what people say to us. So I definitely believe in this idea of beauty, and in a way that's that space that we try to get to. It's more just that the way that the term is used every day. I worry that people just hear it and they think of
oh,
it in a
it's
surface
totally,
way.
it's been contaminated. There's no question.
Yeah.
Especially when they talk about beauty standards and beauty influencers and
Yeah,
all.
yeah, yeah.
It's just
Oh,
it's contaminated.
buy all the stuff so you're more beautiful, and this kind of
When I
never-ending
first
thing. I
started
mean, the poetry
painting,
I'm with, when a beautiful poem, yes, but it's more the do
but
this and
beautiful
you'll be
poems can
beautiful.
even be the poems that strike terror to your heart, or are horrifying, or
Exactly right.
fearful, right?
Yeah. Beauty can
Um,
be very uncomfortable.
when I first started painting, my whole conception of the world changed, because before that I was all about pretty village scenes and pretty vases of
Oh,
flowers, and but after I started painting, I realized, oh my gosh, there's so much beauty in rust on an old implement.
oh wow. Yeah.
Because
You learned a different sensuality. Isn't that
yes,
amazing?
exactly.
Yeah.
Because when you're trying to recreate something on a page, and you have to go around looking at things, trying to understand what it is you're trying to capture, you
Mm-hmm.
begin to see the intricacy and the beauty of everything around you, and it
Oh yeah.
changes everything.
Yeah, in a way, I think it's what we're trying to do here. That's why we create things. It's first of all to wake up. We're like this kind of waking tip of this, I don't know, fractal nested ongoing group of cognitions or something. We're constantly like learning how to better observe ourselves and widen what we are, and we do it through what we create for each other, and through those meeting places of art and books and science and so on. But when did you start with your art? I wanted to ask you. Like
I
when
started
was
painting when I was 50.
wow. Why?
um,
I
I
would have
I
thought you'd been doing it
remarried
your whole life or something.
I remarried when I was 44, and about 9 months later I got pregnant. So
Wow.
my daughter was born when I was 46,
Oh, that's wonderful.
and
Or I don't know if it was, but it sounds wonderful. Yeah,
oh,
challenging too, I guess.
she has well, I mean, there are challenges with motherhood always, but she has been
Uh-huh.
the light of my life,
Oh, I
and
love that.
she's certainly kept me young.
Yeah.
And I've learned
Yeah, I
so
didn't even know
much.
you
But
were 50 yet.
oh, I'm 75.
What?
Yeah.
What?
Well,
Oh.
the light is kind to you on these screens, but anyway, I'm 75.
Okay, but even if you have the best light in the world and the most whatever, sorry, but I mean,
Well, thank you anyway.
I would have
So,
never even
but
gotten close to guessing that. Not
but
that
the
it matters
story,
because,
but
but
yeah,
still, it's good that you're young, you know, in
but the
energy.
story that I want to tell is that when she was born, my husband had a very demanding job because he works in high tech in Silicon Valley, and so he was traveling quite a bit. And by the time she was like 3, 4 years old, I started to think I need to have some sort of an outlet for myself once in a while. And so I found this little art class on Monday night at the community center that I could go and take. And
Oh,
we had
hmm.
moved into a house that had a lot of empty walls, and I thought, well, I'll just paint some village scenes for my walls or something. And I started taking this art class, and it was a revolutionary experience because I mean, one of the first things I discovered was I don't like being incompetent.
Mm-hmm.
I'm 50 years old and I'm not used to being incompetent. And so I'm
That's very
almost quit
hard, yeah.
many, many times because my first attempts were so childish and amateurish, and I just felt like a fool. Many times I walked out of the class in the middle of the class because I just couldn't bear to be there for the at the end of the class. We'd always put our work up, and then it would
Yeah,
get
yeah.
critiqued by the
Thank you for
teacher.
sharing that. I've taken an art class. I can understand. And I was, yeah, I couldn't, everyone else could do it and I couldn't. So, and I had that same kind of like, oh, I'm used to being good at things.
Yeah. But I was fortunate in that at the same time I had started working on a garden in my backyard.
Mm,
And I had taken one of these pictures from Better Homes and Gardens that lays out the plan for you, and it tells you what plants to buy. And you go
mm.
buy the plants and you dig the holes and you put the plants in there. And then you look at it, and it doesn't look
Oh.
anything like the picture of the garden at all. So I thought, oh, well, I need to take the long view of this garden. It's probably going to take 3 or 4 years before it looks like the picture.
Mm.
Can I do the same thing? It's hard, but can I do the same thing with my art? Can I just
Oh.
give it the space to see? And I learned a very important thing through this process of about 5 years that, and I think it's a principle of life, and that is that your vision always outruns your skill. So what you
Your
think you
vision
want to
always
paint,
outruns your skill.
you have a vision of what you want to paint, of what you want to make.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have the skill to produce it, but you try, and what you get doesn't measure up.
Mm.
And so that's what drives you either to quit, or it drives you to gain the skill that you need to meet that vision. So you
Mm.
gain the skill to meet the vision, but by the time you get there, you now have a bigger vision. And that's
Yeah.
going to drive you to build other skills. So over the years, I had to build many, many, many different skill sets in order to get closer to being able to achieve the vision that I always had in my head. But it didn't matter how far I got with my skill set, my vision still outruns my skill. That's what
I think
drives
that's
us
a little bit of a
to
key
life.
there.
Hmm?
I mean, that's what you just said. It's kind of it works on different scales as individuals, but as communities, as
Mm-hmm.
countries, as a planet. So that makes the vision is very important, you know. What vision do we have right now as a planet?
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
probably not a very good one, and we're in a way creating that future out of that vision.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a
Well,
lot of us
yeah,
have
and you
a
can
hopeful
have a
vision.
very small vision. Your vision can be, I just want to survive.
Yeah,
Or you can
I
have
just
a
want to get through this
bigger
day in a good way.
vision, you know. I think of let's take it all the way down to Michael Levin's cells. Okay,
Mm,
he takes the frog skin cells and he scrapes them into a bowl of medium,
yep.
and they're in that bowl of medium. They gather up and make another little living entity that's capable of motility, and it's moving around and it's gathering up other cells and making new
Yeah.
entities.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, those cells
Yeah,
had some kind of a vision. they're thrust into this environment. They don't have much choice. Well, he said they did have a choice. He said the choice was either to just spread out, that they could spread out into a mat and still survive, or they could gather up into this little motile thing and still survive. He always represents that as these cells get together and they're doing what they want to do now, because before they were stuck being skin cells. But I want to challenge that a little bit, because when they were skin cells, yes, they were stuck and they had a role that they had to play because they were skin cells. Who's to say that that role is diminished in any way from the role of being free to roll around in this little pond of medium? Because as a skin cell, you have many kind of higher vision of supporting the entire entity and being the boundary that both protects from the inside and protects from the outside. So in many ways, that could be a glorious role to play. And I think it just all depends on your perspective and your vision and how you see that role and how you're going to live into that role.
And I would say the cells probably don't have like a vision, but they're in a completely different configuration, to go back to what we were saying. So the way their possibilities and parameters for alignment are very different than if they've been scraped. And I've actually talked to Levin about that too. And I kind of think the very act of scraping them and rolling them together, I mean, that's also changing the alignment and parameters of what they're going to want to do, or not want to do. It's hard not to use these words, but of what's going to be possible, right? But to go back to your vision, did you have that kind of habit or pattern before you started art, or was that like something that was that like a real kind of break where you started to understand life in that way? That the vision is always
That's a really good
beyond the
question.
skill.
But I think that everybody lives that way to some extent or other. Otherwise, we wouldn't live. We wouldn't exist, right?
Yeah, that's why dreaming and that's why advertising works in the way. I mean, we always want to believe things can be better.
Yeah, and on any scale, we always live that way. But certainly, as a more intentional thing, once I discovered that in art, it made me more intentional, because I had a deep desire to find that vision, to represent that vision on paper. Partly because about that time I was going through menopause, and it doesn't strike all women this way, but for me, my brain just turned to mush. I felt like I had rats running through my skull all the time. I mean, it was just, my whole body was alert with nerves and brain, this stuff running through my skull. And I'm trying at the same time to be a wife and trying to be a mother. And I've got these rats running through my skull. I couldn't really think straight, and I certainly couldn't articulate the thoughts that I was having.
Oh, so you put it into your body with the art.
Inarticulate. And at the time I only had a toddler to talk to all the time. So I'm just using very simple language. But when I painted, I could represent things that were very deeply meaningful to me, and feelings and ideas that I was having that I could communicate through paint. So
wow, isn't that amazing that you can do that,
skills.
you know? Wow.
You can do it. You
no, but I mean, it's amazing that you
do it because you were in a class with other people that you said could do it, and that's what hung you up there. You have
Probably.
to
I wasn't strong enough
again.
to be compared.
You have to become a child again and be willing to be foolish. Jordan Peterson talks about this all the time, that you have to be a fool before you can be a master.
And to be honest, I really do believe that. And I've even put myself in situations. I think that's why I took the art class, to be very honest, because I do find that it's very important to put yourself in that area of discomfort. I think I just didn't, at that moment, I didn't see it through. But I guess what I was saying earlier about how wonderful it is that you had this experience with going through change in your body, and you found this way of redirecting your own sensuality and expressing it without in a way that you hadn't before. I mean, that's, for me, that just feels just that we can do that gives me
Mhm.
some hope, you know, that
Yes, I mean, human beings are amazingly adaptable. I mean,
hmm.
I've been through at least 10 different lives in my lifetime.
Really,
So,
have you?
yeah,
I
so
wonder about you, like, because you're very smart and you can read all these different things and talk to all these different people. And how did you build that
I
up?
don't have I certainly don't have a doctorate in philosophy or neuroscience, so you
Yeah,
did
but I mean,
that.
those are just papers that say you went to school and got the grades, you know, you
Well,
can
those are
study it
things
without it.
that say that you went to school, that you had ideas, that you persisted, that you know.
It was challenging. I mean, I'm proud of it, but you know about a lot. You've introduced me to like 5 different people, including some philosophers. So you know, you're obviously
I'm
connecting a lot of
curious.
dots and curious. And
I'm
I guess,
curious.
was it always like that? Like, is that part
I
of
I
your,
I think it was like that when I wasn't interested really. Okay, I was going through high school at a time when girls' ideas weren't valued. Let's just put it that way.
all right. Okay.
My sophomore counselor told me, Karen, you shouldn't let people know what grades you're getting, and try to cover up your brain because it's going to make
You
you
were too
unpopular.
smart or something.
I'm trying to make you unpopular with the boys.
Oh no.
And
No.
I mean, I was
Boys love intelligent women.
I wasn't popular with the boys anyway, so that didn't really somehow it didn't really penetrate that he said that to me. But that was what the era I was growing up in. And when I was in college, it was the hippie era. I wasn't so interested in learning. I got a degree in English and drama, and it was
Oh, drama.
interesting, and I met a lot of interesting people, but I wasn't passionate about that stuff at all. But after I graduated from high school, I got so interested in archaeology
Hmm.
and history, and then later in economics, and was really pursuing a lot of those ideas. And once I got started on some topic, I would read every book I could find on it. I always had libraries full of stuff that I'd been reading. But then for many years, I kind of shifted into a different mode, being a mother and doing family life and all that.
Hmm.
And I lived in Japan for 3 years. And when I came back
Oh,
from Japan and I remarried and I met my husband now. And then I had this second child at the age of 46. And so then that took up some
wow.
time.
What an adventure you've been on,
Yeah.
are on still.
I've been a
So,
farmer.
a farmer?
I've been a missionary.
Whoa.
Been an intercultural consultant. I've done all kinds of different things. I was a state legislator in Iowa when I was young, a
What?
politician. So
What?
I've been through a lot of things that have, um, let's say, broadened my perspective of the world. So when I read now, when I get interested in some topic, if I get interested in some aspect of art, let's say, this is what got me. You wanted to know how I got started with the meaning code. I
Yeah,
read Jordan
I did.
Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning,
Ah, Jordan Peterson,
after,
yeah.
yeah. And after reading Maps of Meaning, I realized, I mean, it was very difficult the first time through. So I read it a second time. And the second time, as I was reading it, everything snapped into place because I could see it through the lens of art. And I thought, that's really peculiar. Why would this very complicated book on archetypes and hierarchies and this structure of meaning that he's created in this book,
Mm-hmm.
why does art map onto that so well? And that's why I started the meaning code, because I wanted to explore that intersection between art and um, Jordan Peterson. And that's what I've been doing, talking to scientists and trying to understand all these interconnections.
It's a beautiful name. It sounds to me almost as if you've been learning um different languages and uh I mean, just to think of it as language, like the more languages you learn, the more
That's
they start to
exactly
sort of
right.
fit together and sound
Yeah.
like one big language, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Because what I saw early on, like 20 years ago, when I first started seeing these connections between art and other aspects of the world, I could see clearly that art and Austrian economics have really close connections. So all that study that I had done in economics was already showing up in other things that I was learning in creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And then as I started looking at physics and biology and informatics and all of those kinds of things, art
Yeah.
helps me make sense of all of them. So it's not as though I'm learning all these things from scratch.
Hmm.
I have a language that I can translate into all these other things.
And that was just the one that resonated. I mean, it's kind of, I've heard you talk about like the different, is it principles and elements or
Mm-hmm.
of art?
I don't think it's just the one that resonated. I think
Do you think it's
always
special?
trying to put this into words in as brief a way as possible. And I know our time is probably running out, so I need to be a little
Yeah.
bit brief here. But what time is
Okay.
it?
I don't even, I just,
How
oh,
long
we're
have we
at
been at this?
7:41.
Yeah, we've been at this for over an hour and a half already. So
Yeah.
um, the picture that I have sort of is that if you think of if I think of the universe as a work of art, then basically what I'm saying is that underneath all the physics, the laws of physics, there is a set of principles that are maybe guidelines or a matrix of possibility
Mm.
in which choices can be made that will still produce beauty. And so this matrix of possibility is what through the centuries art critics and art viewers have noticed about works that are considered beautiful or meaningful.
Mm.
When you look at those works, you see this matrix on display. And so over the years, that matrix has been refined and defined, and they've come up with this set of principles that sort of describes this matrix of possibility. And it's artists nowadays can actually study this and learn how to apply these principles. But from the beginning of time, when artists painted, it was a natural thing that these principles would come out in the work simply because we're surrounded with it everywhere we look. These principles are on display for us. So when you
Yeah.
paint, it's a natural thing that it comes out in the painting.
So it's like you're taking it's like somehow you're um making visible or sensible these patterns that build the world or build life, something like that, or
Oh, see, I need to get you to write my language for me, making visible the patterns that, yes, that's exactly right. Because um, let's take, for example, well, to me, there's two sets of principles. One is a set of principles that kind of govern creativity to start with, or that create a space for creativity. And the other are the principles that make this pattern visible. Within the process of creativity, constraints, boundaries, your vision always outruns your skill, context. These things are very, very important in the process of making the art, whether it's music or painting or whatever process you're doing for art. But then the art itself consists of certain elements, which are the quantities, and then the principles, which would be the qualities. So the quantities are line, size, shape, direction, color, value, and texture. And the principles are unity, harmony, contrast, dominance, repetition, variation, gradation, and balance.
Mm.
So
Trying to
each,
understand those. They're kind of like
well,
patterns.
yes,
Like the elements are, I mean, something like color is regularized to the human body's way of experiencing light. I mean, you can find ways to really see them as patterns, but then something like dominance or what were the
dominance is one of the principles. Yes.
what are the other principles?
Each one of these we could spend an hour and a half on. Unity, harmony, contrast, dominance, repetition, variation, gradation,
Wow.
balance.
Yeah, those are more like enacted or actions that yeah, it's
So
Gosh, it's
you can
really,
think of
really
each of
interesting.
them as a polarity,
Oh yeah, polarity.
right?
Yeah.
Because you have balance. You could go all the way from, very heavy to very light in balance, or perfectly balanced, or asymmetrical. So each of them is kind of a spectrum.
Yeah, and that's why you call it a matrix, I guess, because it's not just one linear thing. You have all those at once, right? And like
Right.
you said,
So every
computational
time,
explosion, you could have so many variations.
that's exactly right. It's a complete
Mhm.
explosion. Every time you pick up a piece of paint to put a stroke on the painting, all of those factors at once are somewhere in the decision making of putting that stroke of paint on the painting, because it's contributing in some way to the balance. It's contributing in some way to the what may or may not be repetition. It's contributing in some way to gradation. Somewhere along
When
the
you change
spectrum of
one, you
each of
change
them.
all the others. Because is that true? Like if I change one of those, does it change all the others?
Well, because you've changed the context.
Mm.
When I put that stroke of paint, if I have a painting that's primarily warm colors, let's say, and then I
Mm-hmm.
decided for whatever reason, I need some contrast, I'm going to pick up some blue and I put that blue on there. I have now changed the context of the whole painting because the balance
Yeah.
has shifted,
Yeah.
the sense of repetition has shifted, the
Yep.
gradation is out of whack now. So then the next stroke has to bring that stroke and the rest of the painting into alignment. And then the
Hmm.
stroke after that has to take that context and bring it into
Oh
alignment.
wow.
So every
That's
stroke
fascinating. That makes
is
me
a
feel
process.
like it's I mean, now I think of like Tai Chi or something. It's almost like it's a real act of I don't know. There's so much in there. Yeah, I
Well,
can see what
when
you're
you're
saying.
painting, you can't be conscious of all this, because if you're
No,
conscious
you'll
of
go
it, you just
crazy.
stop,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
But if you had, so it starts with a vision and then it ends with the vision manifested. And in between, all these steps take
Mm.
place, which are just a multiplicity of choices, and each choice could go any direction. And
Mm.
each time the choice is made, it changes the context. And each time the choice is made, there's a sacrifice, there's an opportunity cost, because all the other choices can't be made.
Right.
You start with an infinite set of choices, but each choice that you make limits that set and limits that set and limits that set until the end. There's only one possible choice that you can make for the last stroke.
Oh.
So it's this picture of the universe. And to me, that's the picture of the universe as a work of art. But it's very hard to put into words, and I've never found a way to explain it very well, although
You just
interacting with
explained it
you
pretty
has
well.
helped it come out better.
Yeah, I think that was really well. Do you feel like your life, do you feel that in your life as you live your life ever? That process that you just described, like, is it only possible to get a grasp on it when you're creating something?
Well, no, I
That's
think that's a picture of
yeah,
what life. I think when you're talking about
yeah,
making way,
hmm,
I think that's the picture of waymaking. I think that's the
yeah,
picture
yeah,
of
yeah.
living.
No, it resonates.
I think that's the picture of everything. In fact, if I might be able to find it here. Hold on a second. I took a note today. One of my friends posted something on. Yeah, he posted something on Twitter. Philip Goff had made this comment on Twitter.
Hmm.
He said, "Who said this? One might more or less fancifully attribute even to the atom a kind of limited free will." So he was asking who said this. And my
Hmm.
friend got on and made this comment. He said, "A free choice in quantum mechanics is simply one that is not uniquely predetermined by the past history of the universe. The opposite of free choice is superdeterminacy. The existence of free choice simply implies that there are branch points as time flows from past to future, where there arise multiple pathways into the future, all of which are still perfectly consistent with the past history of the universe. In other words, all symmetries are preserved. But when an observer in quantum mechanics, and for observer, you can read intelligent agent, when an observer exercises a free choice, we then call it free will.
Hmm.
So you have both free choice and free will operating. And the free choice can operate all the way down to the quantum level. But free will can only be operated by an observer or by an intelligent agent. So in
Does
his
that relate to the way that each action you make sets you down a certain path?
and I think this happens all the way
Yeah.
down to the quark level, electrons and all those things. Every choice that's made by an electron, there's always a branching set of possibilities out in front of everything. And that, have you read Wolfram's theory?
Oh yeah, I really like Wolfram a lot.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I think I would love to talk to him sometime, because to me that whole idea of this, there's always branching possibilities, fits right in with
This bronchial space.
yeah.
Bronchial space. Yeah, I really I think it is like that. Like I like the word matrix that you use. So every choice you're making in terms of, we could think of it in art or whatever, you're constantly sort of the matrix is shifting for you of which paths are within your cognitive light cone. I'm using that wrong. That's Mike Levin's term, but this space of what you can actually sense and see, right? Which is has to do with your body and your whole past experience. But with each shift, different parts of that kind of 3D fractal landscape of possible paths changes, right? And something about developing our awareness and attention in the way we talked about at the beginning or in the middle, you can start to be the one who's shifting that attention or perception towards different parts of that bronchial space or grid as an individual, but even more so in concert with other beings once you're doing it. And I can see how art is almost like a practice of learning how to develop that skill of um, learning how different patterns lead to different paths, so to speak, different effects, different affects, different connections. And weirdly, you do it as an individual, but then it becomes that meeting place that we talked about, so that it becomes a kind of place where two people can begin to share paths, like a path that I might not have had available to me after talking to you becomes available to me because of that shared space, or after looking at the artwork or talking to you about it or whatever. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
I have to ask, yeah.
I was going to say, this has been terrific. We probably need to wrap it up, but did you have one last?
Yeah, I was gonna say I need to go, but I have to ask, like, last thing is about love, right? Like, do you have an experience of that when you're doing this artwork? Like, what is that word? Because this is love and philosophy, so, and we have already mentioned love a little bit, but just to end it, like, do you think much about that when you're doing the work you do, or
Let's see. I like the
the
definition of love that talks about willing the good of the other.
Oh, that's really good, yeah.
So artists often have a funny relationship with their paintings. And quite often when you're painting a work, especially if it's a challenging work, it'll come to an adolescent stage where nothing is working and you want to throw it out.
Oh.
And I heard this one creativity guru one time talking about this experience. It's common to almost everybody. And he said, when that happens, he said, you have to remember, if this was your adolescent child, you would not throw them out. So
Very
it
good.
happens, he said, just stop and look at that painting and say, I love you, painting.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And I'm going to do whatever it takes to show you that I love you. And then you go back after it. Well, I got to thinking about that one time, and this was probably 20 years ago in my life. I was struggling with some things, probably when I was going through menopause. Life was hard.
Yeah.
And
But weirdly, that time period brought a lot of good things in the somehow.
So I was thinking about that, and I was looking in the mirror, and I looked at myself and I said, I love you, Karen.
Oh.
And I'm going to do whatever it takes to show you that I love you.
Oh, that's very
And
moving, Karen. Wow. We all need to be able to do that at times.
it was very moving,
Yeah, and it
strangely
gives me a
moving.
little lump in my throat.
Try it
Hmm.
sometime, because when you look in your own eyes with intention, it's strangely moving. And I think we need to remember that, because as we have been reminded by Jordan Peterson, um, the golden rule is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But if you don't know how it is that you want to be done unto, there's no way you can do unto others. So until you have learned what love is through loving yourself, you can't really love somebody else in that same way that you're receiving love. So I guess that's what I'd
Yeah,
have to say about love.
that's beautiful. That really helps me. Thank you. It's like you, weirdly, when you look into your own eyes, you expand beyond yourself. So
Mm-hmm.
it becomes possible to love through yourself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I will definitely keep that in mind. So
Yeah, I
let's
think it's
let's
some
let's
sort of
leave it.
contact with reality. And as my guest from yesterday said, the ultimate reality is Jesus Christ. So yeah, that's where I'll leave it. And it's been
Yeah.
great talking to you. And I hope we have another opportunity. There's 1,000 things that we could talk about. Andrea, this is
Yeah, let's
fantastic.
definitely, yeah. Let's choose one and talk again because this has been very beautiful. I have a very good feeling in my body now, and so thank you very much. It was really nice. And thanks for the all the great conversations you're having with so
Oh,
many people.
thank you too. I really enjoy your channel. So, and I'll
Yeah.
put your channel in the description section.
Okay, same.
Bye bye.
Bye.